Hi, I'm Maddie, and I read chapter 9 in the book, which was focused on Asian Americans. So in this presentation, I will specifically be talking about the first arrivals of Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants in the United States, and I'll also touch on differences between different Asian cultures and differences between the Asian minority group and other racial minority groups, and just other things that I found important or interesting in the chapter. So members of the various Asian cultures present in the United States speak a variety of different languages, practice different cultures, and while Asian Americans do bring a lot of diversity into the United States, there are general similarities which have kind of created this perception of Asian Americans in the U.S. and has also shaped the experiences that they have in the United States. So the chapter first specifically focuses on Chinese Americans, immigrants from China started to arrive in the U.S. in the early 1800s after they were kind of forced to leave their own homelands due to rapid growth of population. They were drawn to the West Coast in the U.S. Due to the gold rush of 1849 and the opportunities that presented. And when they first arrived in the U.S., Chinese immigrants and whites really worked well and got along with decent harmony. However, the chapter goes on to talk about the Noel hypothesis, which we have read about before, but it basically argues that racial and ethnic stratification occurs when a contact situation has the following three conditions: ethnocentrism, competition, and a differential in power. So an anti-Chinese campaign began once these three things started to occur in the West Coast. And before the campaign was started, Chinese immigrants were admired for their work ethic and everything like that. But once the economy started to crumble, the Chinese immigrants were seen as more of a threat. And because there was really no reason for equal pay, there was no requirement for equal pay, the whites started to they saw Chinese immigrants as cheap labor and they started to take advantage of them. And the Chinese immigrants weren't allowed to become citizens. So they really had very little power in this situation. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which was inspired by the anti-Chinese campaign, was passed in 1882 and banned virtually all immigration from China. And it wasn't until the 1960s that large-scale immigration was allowed once again in the United States. So immigration from China really started to deplete. And with the racism and anti-Chinese campaign that immigrants were facing, they started to form their own communities, which were known as Chinatown. And this was kind of just like a safe space for them. Although there was internal conflict within the society in Chinatown, it really was fully functioning, and they had an established government that kind of organized things within the society and represented them to the larger society. And they were really actually able to preserve their culture and their traditions and their languages with Chinatown. So chapter 9 secondly focuses on Japanese Americans. So immigrants from Japan started to arrive in the U.S. shortly after Chinese immigrants. And it really started off slow. However, with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese immigrants really started to outnumber the Chinese immigrants. And that obviously didn't change until the 1960s. The contact situation for Japanese immigrants was similar to what the Chinese immigrants faced. They arrived in the West Coast, they began to work, they had very little power. And then an anti-Japanese campaign was started. And in 1907, a gentleman's agreement was actually made and signed between Japan and the U.S., which limited the number of immigrants that could come over that were laborers from Japan. However, there was a loophole in the system that women kind of could get past and still come over to the U.S. So the gender ratio was kept pretty even. One of the hardships that the Japanese immigrants faced was brought by the anti-Japanese movement and was an attempt to forbid the Japanese immigrants from participating in agriculture. So a large amount of Japanese immigrants were participating in agriculture. And the Alien Land Act, which was passed in 1913, was a bill that basically said that anybody that was ineligible to become a citizen in the United States was also ineligible to own land. So this really was targeted at Asian Americans. But the goal of the bill really wasn't fulfilled because a lot of these Japanese immigrants would put land under their children's names because legally their children that were born in the U.S. were citizens. So due to the discrimination that the Japanese immigrants faced, the Japanese known as Issei, they started to establish their own enclave, which was centered around agriculture. By 1940, over 40% of Japanese Americans were involved in farming and agriculture, and even those who weren't, a lot of them were involved in something similar like gardening. And their enclave really created stimulation within the economy. They would, as much as they could, they would buy and sell and do business with other Japanese Americans. However, even though they had great success in this enclave, with the harsh racism and discrimination that the group faced, many of them were forced to stay within the enclave and were unable to get a higher education. So Japanese Americans faced a huge wave of discrimination after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. So the prejudice that people already had against Japanese Americans really grew after this. And 2 months after the attack, President Roosevelt signed an order to forced Japanese Americans living on the West Coast to relocate. So they were basically put into these detention camps, and this ranged from men to women, young to old, all Japanese Americans. And the government kind of paid no attention to whether they were citizens or not. They just saw all Japanese Americans as this kind of like threat. So they were forced to abandon their possessions, their homes, their businesses, and move into these crowded living quarters. So some were able to get out eventually by joining the military or agreeing to move far away from the West Coast. However, some weren't able to get out, which some of the ones that weren't able to get out did take advantage of their time in these camps and learned more English, learned other skills. And finally, 3.5 years after the camps were started, the Supreme Court ruled them as unconstitutional, releasing all of these Japanese immigrants from these camps. However, they really had very little compensation for their time and everything that they had to spend there. So when comparing the minority groups of Japanese and Chinese Americans to others, it is evident that there are vast differences. So the dominant group in the U.S. Did not try to control the labor of Chinese and Japanese immigrants the same way they did with African Americans and Mexican Americans. Chinese and Japanese Americans were seen as more of a threat. So to me, this kind of went back to in the Chinese American section, it talked about how the whites were encouraged to work as hard as the Chinese Americans did. They were almost admired in a way. That is until the economy started to deteriorate. The Chinese and Japanese immigrants were not seen as a military threat. And unlike other minority groups, the Chinese and Japanese immigrants were able to create enclaves that provided further opportunities for them educationally and economically. So while comparing the education across different racial and minority groups, it is found that the extent of schooling for Asian Americans differs from other groups. As a whole, Asian Americans achieve success in society standards for education, but educational achievements do differ within the group. So I feel like the point in that was that there are these stereotypes, but for Asian Americans in education, but there are different situations within the group of Asian Americans. Asian Americans do have a long history of political power. However, the group's political power is limited by their small population size, institutionalized discrimination, and other racist practices. So similar to Hispanic Americans, less than half of Asian Americans voted in the 2016 presidential election. However, it is likely that the group's involvement and kind of predicted that the group's involvement in political power will only increase. So prejudice against Asian Americans is still very much alive, since blatant racism might not be as occurring as often. Modern racism has kind of taken over. Asian Americans still deal with hate crimes, and the chapter talks about different racial slurs that are still being used in the United States against Asian Americans. So I found this chapter very eye-opening. Of course, we are all aware of that immigrants from different minority groups have faced some kind of discrimination, racism, and hardships, but to really read about it and study it and just see the cold hard facts on paper really puts it into perspective. And I think what really rubbed me the wrong way about this chapter is that so many of these things happened so recently. For example, the detention camps that the Japanese Americans were forced into only took place in the 1940s. So there are people still alive that were alive during this point in history. And so when you hear about things like this that have happened in the past, these huge discrimination-based things that have happened, it just seems like it should have happened so many lifetimes ago, but in reality it hasn't, and things like this are still happening. So that was kind of like the way, like just something that I kept thinking about while reading the chapter. So I am grateful to have read this chapter and learned more about discriminations and everything that Asian Americans have faced and that they still face today.